Hello and welcome to the Echo Chamber podcast. My name is Tony Groves and today the tables are being turned. I'm delighted to say that I'm joined by my new co-host. This man I feel is already part of the Tortoise Shack furniture. Indeed, his work on freedom of information and investigative journalism is something we've been piggybacking on since we started the podcast. So it gives me great pleasure to reintroduce to the pod DIT Lecturer, author and investigative reporter Ken Foxe. Ken, great to see you again, buddy.
You too.
The reason we've done this is because today's guest... you might know him as William H. Bonney on Twitter. You may know him as a tinfoil conspiracy theorist whack job. Around here, we just call him Martin McMahon. Martin, we are having you in today just because you've written 12,000 words on bogus self-employment, and we've been waiting to do this for a while, buddy.
I have been waiting a while to do this, but first I have to say you guys are doing a great job, yada, yada, yada. You know, it's nice to see new voices coming up. This is good. We see new guests. Yeah, doing a great job. Have to give you loads of praise for that.
Very good.
No, yeah, I've been a long time talking about this, almost 20 years talking about this, and 20 years chasing this. So yeah, I'm looking forward to doing it.
Well, I suppose the best the place to kick us off is we were kind of kicking around. I know me and you previously about this, and you were trying to explain it. You've written a book on it, bloody 80,000 words, and I know we put up 12,000 on our own website. But when we looked at it, a lot of it was, when it boils down to me, there was an element where they said we were getting some money was better than no money, was almost like an underline. And I think the words were used that we were getting money from a recalcitrant.
Well, first of all, you have to explain what's going on. And it's very, very simple, really, what's going on is that the law and precedents and the judgments that have come out of the courts say that you must decide somebody is employed or self-employed based upon these precedents. And that's what the law says. Civil servants didn't like that. The industry didn't like it. And by the industry, I mean all industries didn't like it. Revenue in particular didn't like that. It took the power away from them to decide who was an employee, who was self-employed. And it placed it firmly with a section within the Department of Social Welfare called Scope, the Scope section, which has existed forever. And it gave that power to Scope. Scope always had it, but it gave them the right to exercise it.
But in simple terms, we both work together, we both do the same job, we both fulfill the same roles, and we both have the same, I'm holding a shovel and you're holding a shovel, or whatever the equivalent may be. But I'm actually a PAYE worker and you're deemed self-employed.
Yeah.
Legally speaking, that means that you're at a disadvantage if you're deemed self-employed because you've no sick pay, you've no holiday pay, you've no...
But at the same time, there are some advantages.
Clearly.
And oftentimes people have a short-term view of this, whereby they probably pay a little bit less tax than their PAYE colleague, and perhaps they're a little bit younger, and then 10 years passes and they're still doing it. And all of a sudden their entitlements aren't building up the way the PAYE person, maybe they do get sick because they're getting a little bit older. And some of those advantages of having paid less tax all of a sudden start to disappear as the PAYE worker disappears over the horizon, kind of with all the benefits that comes with that.
Well, if you look back far enough, this form of where the state accepts you or calls you self-employed, it was always used in the upper echelons of industry. You know, a guy became a consultant and he got paid handsomely for being a consultant. So there was a trade-off between the employer and the employee, and money solved the problem. But over the years, what has happened is that trade-off has disappeared. And now those who are bogus self-employed are in far worse condition than historically it was, and there's far, far more of them. Far more. Like we see the government, when they talk about self-employed, they talk about it in entrepreneurs and own business. But the vast majority of people who are self-employed are working as employees, and the only difference for them is a technical difference. They're not entrepreneurs in any sense of the word. They are carrying out the same duties as self-employed as they would have previously done as employees.
And I mean, I think Because it's not, I know in the article you wrote, you talk about kind of the courier industry and also the construction industry, but this is something that started to infest every industry. I mean, it's a part and parcel of journalism. I know there's an issue in RTE with it. There's issues in the technology industry.
Yeah.
So it seems to be spreading its tentacles everywhere.
There was a very interesting, but there was a very interesting thing on when one of the pieces went up, Martin, that you'd written. A guy commented anonymously for fear of himself. He said, I've an IT company and we tender for contracts, and I have a headcount of 12 people who work for me. We tender for a contract and we get undercut by someone who has nobody who works for him, but he's going to subcontract all of the work to other people and try and, and I can't compete with that because I want to keep people on payroll, and I'm coming up against people who are, winning contracts and then going out and getting people, so it is kind of...
If you take, in the piece that I put up, I put up a chart of government expenditure. Now, government is spending in the year, I think that year was 2015 or 2016, 27 million to one principal contractor. And so it's state money they're giving. And this principal contractor is then able to call everybody below the level of site foreman, because that's what they have stated. Anybody below this level of site foreman in the construction industry, they now deem self-employed, regardless of what they do, regardless of their relationship with the employer. They just deem them self-employed. And there's nobody to say, well, you can't actually do that. That's not how the law works. In fact, revenue and social welfare are working with them to make it this way. They want it this way. Because the alternative to classifying thousands and thousands of people with the stroke of a pen, and that's really what it is, it's basically changing A-class PRSI to S-class PRSI. It's just a change from an A to an S. That's all the administrative function that's involved in it. The alternative to doing that is actually getting up off your arse and going out and doing what your job says. Be an investigator, go investigate, but don't use the rules the civil servants have given you. Use the rules the judiciary have given you. And there's a crisis in this, in that separation of powers. It's not the states, the politicians' power or the civil servants' place to overturn what the courts have said. The Supreme Court was very clear. These are the rules you must follow. And basically the civil service and industry said, well, we don't like those rules, so we'll just ignore them.
I think that's, but you see, remember, I think the phraseology used by the guy in the revenue himself said, well, this is say an area that was typically recalcitrant. So they kind of almost plumosed it to the point where we're going to work to this system, and we may bring more into the fold eventually. Plus you've also got, Martin, we're talking about a period of 10 years where construction went through the floor.
That's right.
You're talking about, the global financial crisis. So there's more precarious work. There's more people lost their jobs in bigger numbers. And in the industry that was worst hit was actually construction. Ireland was too dependent on that. We know that we're too dependent on the construction industry. So realistically, is some of this not just Ireland getting back on its feet?
Okay. Put it this way. If you look at the figures across the EU of rates of self-employment, and this is kind of important, the countries that do best are the ones with the lowest rates of self-employment. Germany is somewhere about half our rate of self-employment. 9 out of 10 people, more than 9 out of 10 people in Germany are employees. And those people are all contributing to society. Their employers are contributing to society. They all have to pay a dividend, like we pay PRSI. PRSI is the dividend on work. Employers pay a bigger proportion than employees. It's a deal between early risers and the government that there's a safety net. Now, what has happened is that in order to reduce the numbers on the unemployment register, government have said, we'll turn a blind eye to your work practices. We don't care whether you call them employed or self-employed, as long as those numbers reduce. You might think, okay, that's a really good thing. Okay, so they're loosening up and they're creating jobs. but we'll say the average earner on 40 grand. He's contributing, or she is contributing, just over 12 grand in tax and PRSI to the state. A genuine self-employed worker is contributing 3 grand or so less, and that's the employer's contribution that's missing. A gigafied worker is contributing 4% PRSI plus USC, nothing from the employer, and now has rights which were announced by Minister for Social Welfare and Leo Varadkar only a couple of weeks ago. And the money they're contributing doesn't wash its face for what the cost is on what they are now going to get. So it's draining the PRSI fund. And it's draining because employers are getting away without paying the lion's share of PRSI. So now they're able to say, well, these people are inside the tax net. But what they're not telling you is that it's costing you to have them inside the tax net. It would actually be cheaper to leave the black economy alone instead of trying to regulate it, or half-arsed regulate it.
And I mean, I suppose when you look at the figures and people are thinking in terms of entrepreneurs and so on, and kind of job creation and self-employed people and companies, but there's no jobs created. This is just one person. They will never employ any other person. That's not a possibility. Well,
there's a couple of things happening. In the past, you would have had single self-employed people without employees, and that was always your indicator number. Where's your gigification? Where's your bogus self-employment in that? And the only 2 widespread investigations ever carried out in the state put it in around 20%. And that was just construction, but it was big numbers they investigated. They investigated 60,000 people in construction, and a fifth of those were bogus self-employed. Now, those were the low-hanging fruit. They weren't the difficult numbers. They were able to do that in a year. So when you hear, and it's a constant line from employers' representatives, oh, it's a complicated area, it's difficult. No, it's not. Some of it is. The vast majority is very simple. And the Chief Inspector of Taxes, the guy who actually came up with some of these deals, he recognised that that's the case. And he explained it in a quote himself. And he said, it's difficult to describe an elephant, but you know one when you see it. Disguise it, it is still an elephant. So they know what bogus self-employment is. They absolutely know. But they are turning a blind eye, and even more than turning a blind eye, they're actually facilitating it in vast numbers. In vast numbers. The social welfare is a conveyor belt of people into gigification. And what gigification is state-sponsored bogus self-employment. That's where it differs from general bogus self-employment. General bogus self-employment, if the state catches you, they may not do you. Gigification is the state working at the very highest levels with civil servants, with employers' organisations, to usurp the law. And that's it, full stop.
And ultimately, I suppose, when you have any system like this that's clearly not working, that's not delivering for the people who are employed under it, who actually benefits from it? Like, who are the main beneficiaries?
Oh, well, it's for an employer to misclassify somebody as self-employed, you're looking at, it's around 30% saving when you take all the entitlements, holiday pay, sick pay, maternity leave, if you get injured in the workplace, insurance. There's so many things they're getting away with.
You might even have to set up a pension scheme.
Yeah, you have to have a state administrator. You have to have at least a PRSA.
Yeah.
You have to have someone, maybe a HR representative who has, you have to have certain structures. Like, bloody hell, everything has to have a code of conduct and all of these things. Whether you get someone to outsource it to it, all of these places need to have some form of formalised employee. Then there may even need to be, if it's IT or something, there probably has to be a career progression. There's personal development plans. There has to be all of these headaches that come with actually having staff, that you have to be interested in them and actually help bring them on. You don't need that if you just have someone who's in there on a...
Well, you mentioned journalism. And journalism is actually, was very involved in this from the very get-go. this group of civil servants and high-ranking people who met to usurp the legislation that existed, the NUJ was very involved in that. They were in the second meeting of that. The second meeting. And when you consider that this group was set up to overturn a specific case, it was a kangaroo court. They decided what was going to happen in another courtroom and in a quasi-judicial tribunal. And they instructed the quasi-judicial tribunal, no matter what evidence was presented, this is the decision you come out with. And that's what the Social Welfare Appeals Office has done since 1993, they've been doing it. It's a charade. The Social Welfare Appeals Office is an expensive piece of theatre. They pretend to hear these cases, but the result, the decision they're going to make, was already made 20 years ago. So anybody who's using the Scope Office, and it is the only actual avenue to use to overturn bogus self-employment, you're wasting your time. It takes 6 years if the state is on your side, costs maybe $1 million in legal fees. That's when the state is on your side. But they haven't been on anybody's side since 1993. So you get buried in Scope. Scope they make their decisions according to the law, and then you're kicked into the Social Welfare Appeals Office where they make decisions according to policy, and they are political policy, and they're very clear about it. It's in their decisions. And yet nobody's saying you can't do this. You have overstepped your boundary.
And you talk historically about, I suppose, the courier industry and the construction industry, and it'd be fair to say the courier industry wouldn't necessarily be renowned as one of the great lobby groups of Irish society, so one would have to suspect that
it's problem.
Probably the other industry that...
I organised within the courier industry. I actually organised. I was the person who organised. I got out there, I met the guys, I organised, I uncovered everything that was going on. We organised a protest, we went to Leinster House, we spoke to politicians. I have never stopped pushing this in 20 years because I was actually present. I saw the corruption, and no matter what happens, I'm never going to let that go. It was disgusting. So yeah, we did all of this. We followed all the routes that everybody's meant to follow. But at the time, there were only maybe 700 couriers in Dublin. Now, with the Deliveroo's, the
Just Eat,
there's thousands. There's thousands.
Yeah.
But there are several judgments now from Scope, quite a few from the EAT, which have said these people aren't self-employed.
Employment Appeals Tribunal, folks. Just Mark likes to go into...
Well, very often the rule of thumb in revenue was considered that if you did 80% or more of your work for a single employer, then you were an employee. And it was kind of a simple rule of thumb.
Well, even
I know that doesn't apply across all industries, but it's not a bad yardstick. You know, if you're self-employed and you have only one person who gives you any work, that's generally been
a funny one came up this week, and it's the BBC, and this has been ongoing in the BBC. Her Majesty's Customs have been looking into this, Revenue and Customs have been looking into this, and they've been looking at these situations where people have service companies set up exactly the same as an RTE, exactly the same. And these are people who work exclusively for the BBC. In fact, it's tied into their contracts that they can only work exclusively. Same as many people in RTE. You can only work exclusively for RTE, even though you're self-employed.
And I think it's important to say as well as regards RTE that people, when they think of RTE and they think of contractors, they think of the top 10 earners for whom, the other issues around sick pay and holiday pay and so on probably don't become an issue because they're earning such a large sum of money, and they can put money aside. But there's another huge cohort of people within RTE who are on, who are being, employed in this fashion where they only work for RTE, don't work for anybody else. And
we'd call them technical jobs or background jobs. They're not upfront jobs. They're not the people who are on the camera.
They can be. They can be upfront jobs too.
Yeah, they are. But
the NUJ has raised this. RTEs have said that they're going to look at it and they're going to tackle it and on. I think it's important, particularly that they do, because it's very difficult for RTE to then go and talk about work conditions in other places of employment when their own work conditions aren't the way that they
Very
should
fair
be.
point, because we like, I knew from when the collapse came, and I remember First Active disappeared, Ulster Bank, banks disappeared, guys, and they closed it. They don't exist anymore nationwide and the likes. And all of these people then came in and they were like, okay, well, we'll bring this person in who was good in such and such, give them a 6-month contract. And they were rolling over 6-month contracts on the basis that if they did any more, they'd have to give them a full-time job. And they were trying to keep that out as far away as we could. If you're talking about RTE, we know there's some of the first, I'm not speaking out of school here, the first person to pick up on your piece, Martin, was Philip Boucher-Hayes.
Yeah, well, Philip, there are a couple of journalists, and I mean only a handful of journalists, who actually see the implications of what's going on here. Mick Clifford is one, Philip Boucher-Hayes is another. They are the two best out there at the moment. Philip did a series about precarious employment, and as part of it, he went into RTE, and people were afraid to talk to him. Now, if that's not ringing alarm bells for people, and this comes back to unions, on the unions, and it's a really important point, Ken. Unions were complicit in this. The Irish Congress were complicit. They were sitting in the room of what I call the kangaroo court, where there was this high-powered group who sat there, and they wanted something different than what happened. But it was like a court panel, and they were overruled, and the decision to use policy rather than legislation became the norm. Michael Noonan pointed this out to ICTU in 2015, and they said, oh, well, that wasn't our understanding. He said, well, you were there. And he's dead right. They were there. They sat on a kangaroo court and made policy decisions on an ongoing case that was under legally binding determination at the time. So they did sit in on it, and the solution to bogus self-employment has been in the union's hands for 20 years. And I have seen personally 2 unions walk away from workers when workers were just about to win their cases. They walked away. I was one of them, and I went in and I got a unanimous decision that I was right, and the union came off record. This union that was pretending to represent me came off record and walked away just before I went in. I won that case, hands down. There was another one recently where the construction workers, where they were all going into the Social Welfare Appeals Office, and the union walked away. And no explanation as to why they walked away. They walked away 48 hours before these guys were cast into this system where they were left alone facing barristers and solicitors and civil servants. Unions won't fight this because they know employer companies are tooling up. They are bringing in their heavy guns into this secret tribunal, the Social Welfare Appeals Office, where nobody can see what's going on. So if they go in there, they know that if they want to win that case, they're going all the way to the Supreme Court, and that costs them money. So that's one reason why they're not doing it. The second reason they're not doing it is because ICTU was involved. ICTU have permanently prejudiced any decision in the area. And they have completely prejudiced. And it was outrageous that ICTU were there in the first place. And they refused to answer any questions. They refused to rise to debate. They refused to comment on anything that's said about it. Completely blanket, totally blanket. And ICTU need to come out and state their position. And the simple question for any union, and there's lots of them claiming that they're going to tackle bogus self-employment. And here's the question. How many cases have you put into scope? If you haven't put any cases into scope, you're not tackling anything. And I actually know the answer. I know the answer. Because I was in the Social Welfare Appeals Office this year. There are no other cases. None. Nobody is putting cases into scope except for me. Nobody, not the ministers, not revenue, not social welfare, yet scope is the only avenue to decide. It's the only legal avenue. So why aren't they putting the cases in? Not just, and they tend to put, I get one case in and I might have 5 or 6 that have also applied. But until they deal with the one case, they won't even look at any of the other cases. So you have this 5-6 year gap between each case.
Tell us about the impact on people, who actually end up in these precarious situations, particularly for over long periods of time?
Well, firstly, anybody who tries to book this system, you are blacklisted. Everybody I know has been blacklisted. Now, I know of 16 cases, and every single one of them was overturned in the Social Welfare Appeals Office. 16 cases where people were told by the state, no, you're not self-employed, you're an employee. And the Social Welfare Appeals Office overturns them with no new evidence, no new witnesses, no new nothing. They just apply a policy decision to the legal decision and overturn it. The impact on people, and the huge impact, is going to be pensions. And is pensions. And when the legal people catch on to what's going on here, there's going to be case after case after case going through the courts. If your pension is dependent on your PRSI paid, that also includes your employer PRSI paid. So when it's not being paid, you're being denied your PRSI payments from your employer. Not only are you being denied, the state is saying, yeah, well, it's our policy that they can deny it. So yeah, that's okay. But it's not legal. So sooner or later, somebody's going to take a case and say, no, you can't give me that reduced pension because I was employed, not self-employed. So you owe me.
And normally, revenue are quick enough to close loopholes as they crop up. If I suppose the loopholes that are used by the multinational companies aside, but other loopholes, they generally, when they involve normal people,
but this isn't
small
a loophole.
companies.
This isn't a loophole.
It is a grey area that they could tackle.
Funny you say grey area. Before 1998, it was never called a grey area. It was always called the black economy. And it was only ever spoken of as the black economy. The notion of grey area, that the black economy was actually a grey area, came from a representative of all the courier companies who met with a revenue tax inspector in the Burlington Hotel to agree a special deal to call all couriers as self-employed. And he said, he was the first person to say, the black economy is a grey area.
But if you think about it, revenue are forgoing the PRSI that's paid by the employer.
Yeah.
They're also forgoing a significant amount of tax that would be paid by the employee were they PAYE. So the potential or the lost revenue is enormous. So why do they accept it? And I know the point about certain industries being recalcitrant and so on, and people will say that about a whole variety of industries. We won't say what ones people, I think it'd be unfair, but there are ways to deal with that. There's inspection regimes, you come down on them hard for 6 months or a year or 18 months and you make them realize, well, okay, I'm going to pay a certain amount of tax. This is exactly what they do as it is. They go, well, we're going to go after the taxi men this year. We're going to go after the small restaurants this year. We're going to go after this county this year. That's the way they do their inspection. So why don't they do it for this?
Because this isn't just revenue. This wasn't just revenue who made this decision. It was revenue. It was Department of Social Welfare. It was the Department of Finance, Enterprise, Industry and Employment, ICTU, other unions who were present. It wasn't just revenue. Revenue was one of many groups. And it was explained, it was actually the Comptroller and Auditor General who explained why. And he said, it was a way of getting tax out of an area that was traditionally recalcitrant when it came to paying tax. In other words, some tax is better than no tax. Now, my point here is the individual worker is not being recalcitrant when it comes to paying tax. The individual worker has absolutely no choice in the matter. If they're told they're an employee, they pay tax at source, that's it. The people who are recalcitrant are the employers. Now, is it the situation that I can go and sit with you in the Burlington Hotel and negotiate my non-compliance? I mean, this is outrageous stuff. To sit in the Burlington Hotel and say, okay, I haven't done what I was meant to do for 20 years, but look, if we call all these guys self-employed, then nobody sees the problem. That's what's going on. And they're literally blocking cases from going to court. They're literally, the Social Welfare Appeals Office is blocking cases from going to court. if any of these cases get to court, the jig is up, and that's it. The gig is up. It's finished.
I'd be very much thinking about this from a different perspective, Martin. I'd be looking at it as the individuals that are now younger people who are classified now into this, that are coming into the workforce, and this is, as you said earlier, Ken, it may suit their purpose right now. It may suit them, to get. They'll say, well, you've heard it. Journalists actually recently in a radio, a nationwide radio station. A few of them recently got their own sort of shows, and one of them let the cat out of the bag on a conversation, saying, "Oh, look, the last few years I've been kind of deemed self-employed here now, but I'm actually now that I've got my own show, I'm actually working now."
The famous phrase, "I'm doing my own taxes."
Yeah.
And I think it's an interesting thing in Ireland when it comes to taxation, because you have two groups of people. You have a kind of a huge portion of society, and I don't think this happens necessarily in every country, who have been paying PAYE for their entire life, and they don't have a great understanding of tax or the complexities of it, and you try and explain things to them about, when I've tried to do stories relating to tax, people's eyes can very quickly glaze over because they've never really had to look at tax in any great way, because they open their paycheck at the end of the month and everything is sorted out. They might go and claim their health expenses at the end of the year. They might go and claim their flat rate expenses or whatever. But that other world of doing your own taxes, of expenses that are allowed, this world as well, the world of self-employed, of gigification, it's very foreign to them, and they find it hard to understand it, I think.
I agree, but where it'll hit other people is who come into that world and then they decide that they want to go into a bank and they want to apply for a mortgage. They can forget about it if they're in this precarious type of employment. They can forget about it if they want, even some of the, I know I'm broadening it out now, Martin, but I am going to broaden it out for a minute. Even people who go in and they're working for, they're on PAYE contracts, but the contract is 12 hours a week or whatever it is. It all comes down to this classification where they've never worked less than 40 hours a week, but the contract is only 12. They can't qualify for anything either, and we've a whole spectrum. I think when we had Lorcan Surian before, he talked about the rentals, the people who are going to rent for the rest of their lives, the people that are going to be in co-living, is the different stratification. It's all the employment stratification is across the board now. You've teachers giving out because they're doing the same work for different pay, which is they're right to complain, but I wish they'd complain when it was instituted with the union's vote, during the crisis.
For people, it's hard to think of in practical terms. So what does this mean to, we'll pick an industry and we'll say construction. How come they can't build a house for 360k in the private sector? Okay, ask yourself. And I spoke to somebody, I won't mention the name, they're coming in as a guest to us in the next couple of weeks. I spoke to somebody about this recently. In the past, a guy bid for a job. He had a crew behind him that did they were all employees, they did different things. They went in, they built the houses, set price, you had your house built. That's what used to happen. Most of these guys were small operators, but that's how they worked. And they employed people, and they contributed to the economy, and they actually did stuff. Now, those guys still exist. They still exist. But now what you have is gigification. So you have a guy who walks in, bids for a contract. Nobody works for him. He's just making a bid. He has nobody. So he then hires subcontractors to hire subcontractors, to hire subcontractors, to hire subcontractors. And it has gone all the way down the chain now so far that last year a young fella turned up in the social welfare office and told him he got a job. He was a self-employed apprentice. So you have gone the whole strata, the whole way through, and everybody is self-employed. Now, what that does to your costs is every level is a more expensive level than if you used employees. Because they have to factor in the fact that they don't have a safety net. There's no PRSI. And it's also on the supply side. It works the exact same. So you're constantly looking for the cheapest figure the whole time. But what you're doing is increasing costs at every single level. And when you're going from the principal contractor to the apprentice all being self-employed, the extra costs on every single level is why you have to pay $360,000 to build a house in Ireland when it really only costs half of that. And that's what gigification does. It increases costs. Everybody has to get a cut along the line. In the construction sector, it's destroyed the construction sector. So the guy who does have the employees, who can build 10 houses and who's going to do it all above board, he's now competing with the guy who's not paying anything. And he can't compete. And where this gets really interesting is when you take it on to the next level, when it's EU-wide contracts and you're talking millions upon millions upon millions. And Irish companies are bidding for EU-wide contracts based on this bogus self-employed, which gives them an unfair advantage. And basically that's what gigification is. It is a secret tax code. You don't have to pay PRSI. There's your secret tax code. Now what comes with that is you don't have to pay holiday pay. You don't have to pay maternity leave. In fact, you don't have to pay anything.
And you can get rid of people at the drop of a hat.
Like that. And they have no rights. And that was actually argued by the construction company's barrister, that because they're self-employed, they have no right to protest the conditions of employment. And they actually sought an injunction and said that the workers' behaviour was appalling.
So ultimately, whose responsibility is it to fix it?
Social welfare. It is entirely the responsibility of the Department of Social Welfare to decide what class of PRSI is paid. Entirely. Now the problem is that's in the pecking order. Social welfare is behind finance. Finance is calling the shots. And finance is calling the shots, and revenue is making decisions en masse. Thousands and thousands. I mean, the ERCT.
You want to tell people what ERCT means?
The Electronic Relevant Contracts Tax. This is the vehicle they use to classify people in the construction industry as self-employed. Basically, they pay tax PAYE, but they're self-employed. And they pay different rates of tax. Basically, if you're earning 40 grand or less in the construction industry as a self-employed person, you pay no income tax. You pay your contribution, your PRSI contribution of 4%, which is exactly the same as an employee will pay. They'll deduct your USC, and then everything else is written off the costs. Everything.
But then isn't that part of the problem that I know that there's that sense that both parties get something from it. And I know that one side only gets a short-term benefit. And sometimes they're not, particularly younger people are not inclined to look at how things are going to be when they're 50 or 60. They just think in terms of what's, how am I going to go on holidays next summer, or how am I going to buy a new car? And this system doesn't work unless you have buy-in from both sides. From employees and from employers. That has to be said.
It used to be like that, but not anymore, Ken. Everybody on the ERCT system, everybody who's in doing courier services, be it food, they're automatically labelled as self-employed. There is zero input. You have no input whatsoever.
But Ken's point is right, though. If that was the case, then people, in theory, could just say, well, look, that's not for me, and leave the industry and
but
go do something
that's
else.
What's happened in construction. They have left. They have gone abroad. And that's why you have a shortage of construction workers. The conditions are better elsewhere. Same as for nurses or anybody else. The conditions are better elsewhere. It's the most precarious of employment. The most precarious. So gigification is so precarious.
But I think, that this still, when it comes to precariousness in jobs, there's probably a tipping point at which somebody, gets married or has kids or reaches a certain age when they start thinking
something in
a
life
much
cycle.
long-term point of view. But up until then, I know, again, because this was common in journalism when I started in it, there were advantages to being self-employed because you did your own taxes and you therefore paid less tax. And people didn't take that long-term view. They didn't understand that, actually, hang on a second, this is going to affect me in 30 years' time. And they were happy to earn that bit more money than they would have done if they'd been on PAYE. So the system does have there is the two sides to it.
Okay, and I'm glad you brought that up. And I'm glad you brought it up because, and it was the UK who first came out with this. Self-employment or employment status is never a matter of choice. Never a matter of choice. You must fit the specific legislation, the principles, the guidelines handed down from the courts. If you don't, you're not self-employed. There's a third person in every contract. The contract is not just between you and the person who employs you. The state is the third person in every contract. You must pay tax according to what you legally are. So it's not just a contract. I could be happy a million times over. Doesn't matter a jot. Doesn't matter. The legal position is, do you fit the criteria? And if you don't fit the criteria, you're not. You're just not. And the big loss is not between that person and the person that's employing. The loss is to society. When you have, they're describing a pensions cliff. You don't really have a pensions cliff. You have a 40-year lack of PRSI payment cliff.
Time bomb.
That's what you're looking at. 40 years companies have been getting away with this. So the PRSI fund is humongously smaller than what it should be. Humongously smaller. So it's society that loses out. Okay, you might feel happy about the little deal. The little deal, everybody's benefit. The employer's paying a little less tax. You're getting a little less money. Society is losing out. And that's why it's actually fraud. It's social welfare fraud. And you can go to jail for it. 3 years in prison you can spend for deliberately misclassifying workers. 3 years in jail. The big problem for the state here is that when this does break, and it will break, it's inevitable that this is going to break. Inevitable that people are going to top on. It's the back payments. If I go to you and I say, well, I've been in this job 20 years and I was never self-employed and the state has agreed with me. Well, the state issues a demand notice to the employer and says, well, okay, pay us back 20 years of payments that you didn't pay us. And when you're looking at the courier industry, you're talking 30 years of back payments. They owe more than they are worth.
And I think the more it spreads as well from industry to industry, especially, there may be certain industries where people are used to precarious employment, construction, courier, so on. As it spreads to other industries where people's expectations are a little bit different, I think you're right that that time when the point of no return comes where this, the whole system just kind of collapses on the fact that.
And Boucher Hayes said it recently. He said the biggest threat to employment is not robots.
Yeah, he did say that.
The biggest threat to employment is that everybody is boguously self-employed. Because then you have, if you look at Greece has twice as many people self-employed as Ireland. Twice as many. And it's a wreck. The next country to Greece has 3 out of every 10 are self-employed. The next country is Italy. Italy's in the shitter too. Italy's awful. And then there's a little group of countries. There's Poland. Now, is Poland renowned for a great economy? Nobody ever says it is. But right next there is Ireland. Then England. Now, the EU recognises that there is a problem with bogus self-employment in England, and they focus very much on England. But ours is actually worse. It's higher. But nobody's saying anything about Ireland. And in fact, they did a huge report on it recently, and Ireland was completely left out of the report. It was included in one graph, but they only concentrated on the bigger economies. But the laws that are being usurped here are then being used as precedent over in the UK to usurp the laws. They work together. The same legislation that employs the bogus self-employment in England deploys here. So what they're doing wrong here then spreads into the English system and vice versa. And an MP recently stood up in the British Parliament and said, we know what's going on. But our problem here is if that we make these people self-employed as they are legally entitled, or employees as they are legally entitled to be, we lose jobs. And that was the rationale. And that is the rationale. If we make them what they should be in law, we'll lose jobs. But that's untrue. They'll actually have better quality jobs and better contributions to society and less problems going forward. So gigification is, the state is cutting its own throat on very short-term goals. What can we do in 5 years? And unemployment for Fine Gael is the huge one. It's the big thing they keep trotting out. But if you take that about 8% of your workforce, 8%, if you go on Germany's figures, 8% of our workforce is bogusly self-employed. Now, does anybody want to put a figure on what that's costing us? That's a massive amount of money. And there's a hole in...
Oh, well, the difference was obviously, do you remember all year they kept saying we're chasing the revenue receipts were behind on income tax and yet ahead on employment.
Yeah.
And it just didn't tally. And every quarter they kept going, oh, the gap is closing. But the gap was never closing because actually employment was running ahead of target and PAYE was still running behind. So when they overshot at the end of the year in money brought in for income tax, but they should have overshot by a lot more based on the fact that so I think the gap, something was 2.6% ahead on employment and only 0.1 ahead on income tax. That didn't make sense, and they were just delighted to look the other way though, because the
headline jobless rate is the lowest it's been in 10 years.
10 years. It's like that. They have to get some credit for that.
But it has been that great mystery of when you have this falling jobless rate, why haven't income tax returns kind of climbed as they should have?
But even at the end of the year, when they said, well, we did it, we hit our target, it didn't make sense, Ken, because you can't be that far ahead of plan and actually just on plan with the income tax. It just meant that either you were creating yellow pack jobs or you were growing in the bogus self-employment world, which it's probably a mix of all, to be honest. It's not all. Absolutely. It's not just, CEO of Deliveroo bicycles. It's not that at all, but it's also the guy who goes in on tenuous employment or precarious work and just on a not a 0-hour contract but a low-hour contract, and they get him off the list. There's all sorts of ways of doing this.
Nursing is an interesting one, agency nursing, and it's a very interesting one. Agency nurses are still employees. They can still offer their services whenever they want. They have certain amounts of freedoms, but they're still employees. They still have union rights. They still have everything. And yet, agency nurse is no different to your Deliveroo driver. So why is your Deliveroo driver self-employed, but your agency nurse isn't?
Does it boil down to the strength of the particular union?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And this is what I'm saying about the unions. It's very selective what industries are being infiltrated by bogus self-employment. Journalism is one of the worst, without doubt. I mean, I think there's more than 50% of journalists are classified as freelance. I think it's a huge
no, I wouldn't say journalism is the worst, but I think there are problems with it in journalism. But I don't think it's something that the NUJ have sat in their hands on over either. The journalism union have fought hard to get people regularised, to get people on jobs. And I know...
I saw Labour do this. I saw Labour put forward this plan where freelance journalists could get union recognition. Okay, and I saw it. And it's outrageous. All they're doing is normalising gigification. That's all they have done is normalise it. The problem is not that there's so many people who are freelance that they have to be given special rights. The problem is there's too many of them freelance. If you actually investigate how many of them are freelance, it's a lot smaller than in number. Genuinely self-employed people. So all you've done now is normalise gigification in that industry. And Labour had a new plan. Jed Nash brought it out this week. And I tried talking to Jed Nash about it and he totally blanked me. I said, you're not recognising the problem. The problem is not legislation. The legislation is all there. The problem is that the civil service and unions and industry barons have ignored the legislation that exists and have actually put a policy decision in place to ignore it. So more legislation is not going to fix that. It's not going to change it. You must tackle what the problem is, and the problem is the Social Welfare Appeals Office. And it's where this is happening. But the wider problem is that they want it to happen. And they have overstepped their powers. It is not Revenue's position to say, I don't care what the Supreme Court says. We're going to do it our way. But that's what they have done.
Well, I don't know, Martin. There's part of that we were saying in terms of revenue. I've had a lot of dealings with revenue over the last number of decades, and I don't find them at all to be forgiving and looking the other way.
Okay, well, I'll tell you. I'll give you a situation.
No, hang on,
But
Martin.
I do think that revenue adopt a policy of of implementing, the instructions from the department, so that
Yes.
they enforce taxation on the basis of what
Yes.
they're told to do. So there are certain things that they don't necessarily push as hard as others.
Yeah, and if revenue were presented with this and they were saying this is what the duck looks like, it walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, and you move on, that's fine, okay. But my point about revenue is at their core, they are impartial. They will, if they're at fault, they'll give you back your money. If you're at fault, they're coming after you for your money. They're not, if there's a reason why people said why the property tax worked and Irish Water didn't, because one was collected by revenue and one was collected by a.
Okay. And I say this from you guys, and I've seen it from a lot of people who think that revenue is beyond reproach. Generally, beyond reproach.
I think because there are so many large organisations in Ireland that are dysfunctional. That really dysfunctional. The HSE, the Gardaí. I think people look at revenue and they see a very big organisation that by and large seems to do a pretty good job. Doesn't cause an enormous amount of problems. Collects tax, is fair for the most part, and I think people possibly elevate it above where it should be because it is well run. And other organisations aren't. I think that's part of it.
I think it's user-friendly, and that was my opinion with revenue. But I have a letter from the Revenue Commissioners that was sent to the chairman of the PAC, and he is saying, because we found one courier to be self-employed, we decided we call them all self-employed. And I'm going to tell you a little story. I'm reminded, because you say revenue and social welfare, and you think these people should all be above reproach. Every one of them should be above reproach. Back in around 2003, 2004, I was in the circuit court. It was an appeal of an Employment Appeals Tribunal decision. The company appealed the decision. The Employment Appeals Tribunal said this guy is an employee and he was unfairly dismissed or constructively dismissed because he sought an insurability of employment decision from social welfare. And that was the case, and that's what they decided. And this was appealed on a point of jurisdiction in that Social Welfare Appeals Office has the higher jurisdiction, which it does. And I knew that this was going to happen. I knew this was a dead run. All I was trying to do was prove them wrong on the evidence. But the guy that had read out this falsified report in the Social Welfare Appeals Office, for years I've been writing to the Social Welfare saying, you must overturn this decision. This was false evidence. You must. And the Social Welfare Appeals, or the Social Welfare representative on the Kangaroo Court was the only person who ever replied, no matter who I wrote to. If I wrote to the General Secretary, he replied. If I wrote to the Social Welfare Appeals Office, he replied. No matter who I wrote to, he replied. And he said, he just made a mistake. And I know for a fact, because I have the facts, that it was no mistake. So I summons this social welfare inspector into court. I was going to put him on the stand and I was going to make him admit that he never actually spoke to the person that he attributed all this evidence to. So I called him and I put him on the stand and I said, you wrote this report. And immediately there was an objection from the other side. No, he didn't. Or we don't want this report brought into it. And the judge asked him to explain. They said that the person named in the report never actually met this man. And this was evidence that this is the pivotal evidence. In this courtroom, this was a case, a civil case. There was social welfare. There was revenue. I mean, it was a veritable who's who of decision makers. And for this tiny little case in the circuit court. So I put this man on the stand and he crumpled. I mean, he crumpled into a ball. He physically broke down. And I made him admit on the stand that he falsified his report. He never spoke to the man in his report. All this evidence. And this evidence is what makes everybody bogus self-employed. Not just me. Everybody who is. It's the pivotal decision. And he broke down. And the judge in the case looked over my head. And he looked over the legal representatives from the company. And he looked at the social welfare man who was sitting in the courtroom. He had nothing to do with the case. They were in all listening. And he said, this requires another day in court. You do know this. So social welfare have been aware and revenue have been aware. They've all been aware for 20 years that what happened was abject corruption. And not one, I'm the only person that's lifting a hand and saying, I actually witnessed this. I was there. I witnessed it. There's solicitors, barristers, senior counsel, ministers who know that happened. And not one of them has said, oh, maybe that's not such a safe decision. Not one of them. Instead, they've used it as a precedent right across the board in all industries. And that's how crazy this is. I know I can see the two guys are gobsmacked, but that's how crazy this is.
Look, I don't know. I've no other questions, Ken, have you?
No, I think you've explained it very clearly. I think, it's a massive issue. It's a growing issue, and as you say, I think there's going to come a point of no return when something is going to have to be done about it. The more it spreads from industry to industry, the higher the percentages get, and obviously at a point the tax loss becomes so big that they'll want to do something.
There's always a tipping point.
Yeah, there is going to be a tipping point, and what they're mostly afraid of is the back payments.
At the moment, though, Martin, you're the only You're the only broken clock that's never been right so far. Funnily
enough, there are. I mean, I have to say, Ken O'Connor works in the construction centre, and Ken came to me several years ago, and we realised we were talking about the same subject, just in different industries. And Ken he's tireless, never ever stops. And the politicians on the left all know Ken. He believes in 24 hours a day. And the real problem here for politicians, as you said, Ken, this is a simple issue that's very complicated by what they've done. But it is a simple issue. They basically overturned the Supreme Court. That's the simple issue. And everything else is layers of obfuscation to throw you off the scent. So politicians on the left, sit down and read 12,000 words that explains, and really when you've read the 12,000 words, you want to see the documents. So then you have to go to the 80,000 words and reference the documents. But they're all there. This is comprehensive exposure. And when you think of the money involved, this is far bigger than Ansbacher. This is far bigger than dirt tax. This is the biggest fraud yet to be exposed, or yet waiting to be exposed. It's a massive amount of money. Massive.
Okay, I think we'll leave it at that there, folks. I'm going to get my tinfoil hat and off I go. I want to thank you all for listening. And if you think independent listener-led content matters, lads, please subscribe, leave us a review, tell your friends, and show us support from as little as €3 on echochamberpod.com. We rely on you guys to keep the show on the road, and thanks so much for listening again.